So we start chapter 5 of, beg your pardon, 4 of Hamilton. And, actually, one good thing about this book is that she really does stress the importance of the sort of Vedic culture as triggering a lot of subsequent thought, either in defense of the Veda or in resistance to the Veda. So the Mimamsa tradition, the early Vedic tradition, followers of that tradition, have to defend the validity of the Vedic hymns and the performance of the Vedic sacrifice because it's coming under threat from later on it would be Buddhism, Jainism, but within Hinduism. Eventually, Bhakti is going to sort of move away from that. Already in the Upanishads, we have these exhortations to seek the Atman. Not a rejection of the Vedic ritual altogether, but a minimization of it. So I think we've touched upon this. Now consider this. Why should one perform this Vedic sacrifice? The Mimamsa position is because because of the injunctions of the Vedas. The Vedas prescribe Vedic ritual. So then the next question will be, well, why should we listen to these Vedas? Well, what makes them authoritative all of a sudden? And so therefore the Mimamsa project is to mount a defense of verbal authority, right? How do we know things? Well, we know things through sense perception. So we know, I know there's a tree over there. We make inferences about things. I look at smoke, I see smoke in the sky, and I say there must be a fire over there, so I infer the existence of a fire. So science is really modern science is based on sense perception and inference. But also words. We know things because people tell us. We even today in academia, right? I mean, you're listening to me, and you're getting information from words. So likewise in physics, in some extent, you can demonstrate certain things, but the vast mass of things that we just accept because scientists say so. So therefore, that's a third way of knowing something, through words. So the Mimamsa then mounted a defense of knowledge received by words, and those words were the Vedic words. Now, what makes words? After all, science is always it's always improving upon itself. It's correcting, it's probing any claims. That's the nature of science. Any claims are probed, and then as knowledge advances, then previous claims are rectified. Okay, like Newton thought the atom was the final entity, but now science has discovered there's a whole universe within an atom. So that's not the case with the Vedas. You can't do that if you're a Mimamsa. The Vedas have to be eternal and absolute. So therefore, as people are moving away from the Vedic culture, and Vedic rituals are seen as a less important goal of life, the Mimamsas have to work very hard to prop that up. I mean, of course, if you want to be a cynic or a Marxist, you would say that their livelihood depends on this, right? Because Marx said that, well, religion is just invented by those who have access to the means of production. But of course, the Vedas is what produces the world, right? The Vedic hymns are what perpetuates the world. So the Brahmanas are presenting Vedic ritualism as that which sort of just continues, reality as it is, perpetuates reality. Whatever the reason, this Vedic sacrificial tradition went on for 2,000 years. It's an enormous, expansive human time. So who knows what? Of course, they would claim that if the mantras are chanted precisely, perfectly, they would have cosmological effects. They could produce rain. They could produce things. So, in order for this to be an acceptable point of view, then they had to argue a number of things, and one of them is the eternality of the Vedas. Actually, Mimamsa was one of the few traditions in Hinduism that didn't accept God and Ishvara. Most traditions eventually, certainly, Vedanta, Nyaya, theistic traditions, Vaisheshika becomes Sankhya, may have had some non-theistic strains. We know they did have, but was primarily theistic as well. I think scholars overlook that. The majority of Sankhya traditions we find in the Mahabharata, Sankhya, one of the schools, are theistic. But anyway, we'll save that for when we get to Sankhya. Mimamsa, out of the 6 schools, was not theistic because they wanted nothing to interfere with the eternality of the Veda. The Nyaya, yet another school, said yes, the Vedas are eternal, but they're eternal because God is eternal and God articulates them at the beginning of every creative cycle, because creation in Hinduism is cyclical. Mimamsa didn't even accept that. They did not want the Vedas to be not even articulated by a supreme being. They wanted nothing to interfere with the eternality of the Vedas. They didn't accept the cyclical creation because that would mean the Vedas were sort of recreated every cycle. Even that, even if it's the same Veda articulated by the same supreme being, so you could still argue that the Vedas are eternal and perfect and transhuman. They didn't sign off on that. So they went. So they really put effort into defending the eternality of the Veda, and therefore, if the Veda is eternal, it's perfect. Whatever it commands, then humans are enjoined to follow that. Okay, and what do the Vedas command? Ritual sacrifice. So, on a social level, the Vedas also, contain information about the caste system, right? So the Brahmanas, the highest caste, they're the ones now that are perpetuating the ritual, so that gives them access to power. And that's perpetuated in family lineages, so the knowledge is preserved in family lineages, and it's only the Vedas, only the Brahmins that are allowed to perform the sacrifice. Now, I'm not a Marxist, so I don't take a position that this is all about power. And one reason I'm not, that I don't, of course, all of these theorists have something to say. Marx had something to say. Clearly, there's a relationship between religion and power. But it's more to the matter than that, because the Brahmins, if you read the texts that are written by Brahmins, if it was really about power, they would be enjoying that power. And they would be creating a social system in which they could enjoy the power. But actually, the Brahmins are supposed to write texts about themselves. What's the ideal Brahmana? Renounced, without, detached from power, living extremely simply. So I don't think these simplistic explanations, Marxist explanations or Marx-like explanations, capture the whole picture. I don't think we'll ever really know what was going on in those 2,000 years when that sacrifice was primary, mainstream part of Vedic religion. All we know is that these sacrifices were performed. They were daily sacrifices. There were state-sponsored sacrifices, national. We might say that nowadays because there were no nation-states but kingdoms. Kings would perform them, and ordinary people, if they had the resources, you had to have some wealth to perform a sacrifice, and it did cost something. If you had a particular desire, so there were 3 types of sacrifices: the daily ones, and then there were ones that promoted by desire, and then there were sort of large-scale sacrifices. Anyway, what has all this got to do with philosophy? Well, now let's see what are the consequences of the notion of an eternal Veda. The Vedas are words, so she discusses some of this. So that means the words in the Veda, like cook rice for the fire. That means that the word rice is an eternal word. So that means language is eternal, and that means what language refers to is a real thing. There must be a real rice. There must be real things in the world, substantives. That might seem obvious, but we're going to encounter, various schools like Advaita Vedanta, which is going to challenge the notion of a real world and real rice. Vedanta, when we get to it, in this course, is going to say there's no actual real external reality. It's a superimposition. We're going to find schools of Buddhism, Yogacara, which are in a different way. Not going to be saying that quite the same thing as Advaita Vedanta, but also going to be challenging the reality of an external world. So therefore, the Mimamsas are realists. Okay, that's a term in philosophy. There's a real world out there, and that might seem obvious now, but we're going to find that being challenged. So in this way, the Vedics. So then Hamilton discusses the Vedic from this, the interest in preserving this determination to preserve the Vedic sacrifice. We get 6 kinds of intellectual traditions emerge. He discusses them on the bottom of page 59. We get phonetics, how to pronounce. Everything has to be precisely pronounced. They would consider that to be, I don't know, we would probably use the term scientific nowadays. If the meter was wrongly pronounced, then there would not be the effect of the desired effect of the sacrifice. So there was phonetics, which is called shiksha in Sanskrit. There was the meters. You had to have certain number of syllables in the meters. That's called chanda. That's metrics, we might say. There was grammar, and we've discussed an amazingly sophisticated grammar emerges by Panini around the 4th, 5th century. So that's called Vyakarana, yes, 4th century. And then we have etymological analyses. What do words come from? What are the roots of words? What is the basic root underlying verbal and nominal forms? So that's called Nirukta. Then we have astronomy, and then the observation of the heavens. We've discussed this, I know, but she's discussing it again here. So that's on page 59. So the sacrifice had to be performed at precisely the right time for it to be efficacious. So that's called Jyotish, and of course astronomy that eventually develops into Hindu astrology, as it does elsewhere in the world. And then the actual ceremonial rules. How is the sacrifice to be performed? And that's called kalpa. So these are the 6 sort of Vedangas, the angas, the limbs of the Veda. Later on in the course, we'll be doing yoga. We'll be looking at yoga angas. Anga is a limb. So the yoga angas are clearly the 8 limbs of yoga. So anga is a limb, like an arm and a leg. These are limbs of the body. So we have the Veda angas, the limbs of the sort of Vedic, the performance of Vedic ritual. Okay, so therefore the Mimamsas then become are at the core of a lot of intellectual development. Their commitment to preserving Vedic ritual sort of feeds into these other intellectual traditions. Mathematics as well. It's actually not listed here, but mathematics, we mentioned that, and the fact that they had so-called Pythagoras' theorem before Pythagoras. So we shouldn't really be calling it that, actually. We should be calling it, I don't know, something else. But Pythagoras, it was known but to the Indians before Pythagoras. Okay, so that was one thing that this sort of dedication to the Vedas produced a lot of intellectual activity, especially language and the relationship of language in the world. Okay, and also what about knowledge of the world? How do we know the world? Do we know it through thought, which is really language? You can see how this commitment to the language of the Vedas has all kinds of repercussions into what we might call scientific fields. So even though we might think of the Vedas nowadays, we think of it as some primitive ritualistic activity. That's just a modern way of looking at it. Perhaps there was more to the Vedic ritual than we will ever understand. But certainly we do understand that these knowledge systems emerge from it. I suppose a Vedic Brahmana would say, I don't know, would they, if they were born today and they knew about physics, would they talk about the Vedic hymns in terms of sound vibration? I mean, after all, we do know sound vibration produces effects. So might they have argued that if a mantra was chanted precisely, it could have some effect, such as rearranging the atoms in the sky to produce clouds? I don't know. We'll never know the answer to that. We do know these are extremely intelligent human beings that produce these incredible intellectual cultures, and yet they had reason to keep the Vedic sacrifice going for 2,000 years. So it wasn't some primitive thing that that's the kind of attitude that colonialism sort of imposes on other traditions, that it's primitive compared to European culture. We don't use that kind of language anymore. I think we're much safer to say we don't know now what exactly. No one is performing real Vedic rituals anymore. I mean, there are some, maybe a couple of communities that are still keeping the old family lineages going, but it's no longer a sort of mainstream religious activity. So it's can we ever recreate that externally or even intellectually? What was really the understanding behind that? But we do know that the belief was that the cosmos was perpetuated by Vedic ritualism. Okay, now, so what are the implications? So that there's a real world, because the words of the Veda are eternal. They refer to real things, um, and that the Vedas tell us what Dharma is. Dharma is the duty. What are our obligations? What makes humans have choices, unlike animals. Animals just behave like animals. They don't have choices. They're not moral agents. So therefore, later on in Hinduism, animals are not subject to the law of karma. I mean, they are, but they're burning up their past karma. They're not creating new karma. So therefore, it's humans that create fresh karma. They're moral agents. So therefore, how we behave affects our destinies. And so therefore, how are we supposed to know how to behave? And the Mimamsa position, and not just Mimamsa, Vaisheshika, I think most traditions would accept this, that later Hindu traditions. Dharma is that which is uh, expressed in the sacred texts. So therefore, the Vedic ritual has to be performed because the Dharma that is expressed in an eternal text. Period. That's it. And the Vedas tell us what Dharma is. So that's not just the performance of the ritual, but then it's a whole social order, that a whole society that is needed to support the performance of Vedic rituals. We need administrators, we need merchants, we need labor force, the entire society, the center of which is the preservation of Vedic ritualism. So you need different castes and everybody, to perform their different functions. And so so the caste system emerges. We certainly find that sort of expressed in the earliest texts. Now, later Hindus, there's going to be a debate: was caste by birth, or should it be by activity? If it's by activity, then that modern society has caste by whatever if you want to divide society into priests and intellectuals and administrators and merchants and the labor force, well, you could argue any society has that. Question is, are you bound to the caste you're born in? We would reject that in the modern world. And modern Hindus would say, well, in the earliest texts, there are signs that it wasn't bound by birth, that it was freer. And that becomes, at a certain point, Dharma texts are written, and then it becomes more birth bound. I work in the text of Bhagavad Purana. However, differences of opinion of how you date that, but certainly pre-modern. I would date it in the 4th century myself, but others dated later than that. But nonetheless, that text very clearly says caste is not by birth. It should be by your guna karma, by your personality and your inclination and your actual work, and that should determine your caste, not your birth. So you could be born in one caste, but then you have the disposition and nature of some other kind of work associated with another caste. You should be allowed to perform that work. So there are references like that in the ancient text, but for the most part, it seems that you were, as anywhere in the world actually, you would be doing the work of your family and your parents and your grandparents, and that would be a family line of work. But that was the same in Europe, by the way, up until about the First World War. Maybe not quite so rigid, but certainly, if your dad was a farmer, you were a farmer, and that was it. So therefore, the caste system emerges, and a lot of analysis of that in another genre of text called the Dharma text, the Dharma Sutras. What are the occupations of these different castes and so forth. Okay, so so she talks about something about that, and the other thing that she mentions on page 61 is, from an analysis of grammar, she gives the example of water wets grain. Let's take a sentence like water wets grain. Okay, straightforward sentence. But if you analyze that, you could think of it as grain is wet by water. So now what's the agent of that? Well, water is the agent, right? Because grain is wet, so it's passive, it is wet, and it's wet by something. So that thing that wets the water that thing that wets the grain is wet, it's wet by water. So water is the agent. Agent meaning it's the one doing the action. So that means that an agent can be non-personal. Water is not alive, it's not personal. So if water can wet grains, or grains can be wetted by water, an effect can be produced by an agent that is not alive. Okay, what's that? How's that relevant to the Vedic sacrifice? Well, the mantras can produce effects, even though the mantras are just sounds. So that would be a way of thinking about how can cosmological effect like rain be brought about by an impersonal, something impersonal like a sound. So all of this kind of analysis, then analysis of grammar, analysis of action, what is action, how does action take place, sophisticated analysis is coming out of this need or this commitment to preserving the authority of the Vedas. That the Vedas are authoritative, and what we say, we are bound to do what they say. So the chodana is a term, the injunctions, right? We're going to contrast this with Vedanta. Vedanta is going to say, that action is secondary, that it's not the ultimate goal of life, that the ultimate goal of life is to search for the self. Okay, so keep all this in mind. It may not sound very philosophical, but it's going to really be at the base of much philosophizing, both within Mimamsa, amongst the Vedic ritualists, but also responses, resistances, and rejection of their points of view. Okay, so it's kind of important she does spend some time on this Vedic origins of Indian philosophy. So therefore, Mimamsa was all about what action. Okay, the Mimamsa tradition, their primary goal of life is to act, right? The chodana, which are the injunctions, the orders, the commands of the Vedas, and that's what determines what action is. Otherwise, how do we know how to act? Right? How do we understand what action is in the optimal benefit of human society? And so the Mimamsa would say, well, that action which is not just invented by powerful humans, right? Later on in the Mahabharata, we're going to see discussion of Dharma. And, there's going to be statements where no one knows what Dharma is. And then other statements would say, well, actually, even Yudhisthira, Bhishma, the great Bhishma says, well, Dharma is what powerful people say it is. That's it. Some powerful person emerges, exerts power over other people, and then that powerful person determines what Dharma is. So perhaps like a pope or like a president or something. But the Mimamsas are not going to take that view. It's not going to just be randomly connected to some powerful person. It's what the Vedas, the eternal Vedas. And why are they authoritative? Because they're eternal. They have no author. Okay, so enough said about that. And so therefore, and so the other thing that emerges from in Mimamsa is how do you interpret a sacred text? A whole art of, or science, if you will, or method, perhaps is a better term, of textual interpretations, what nowadays we would call hermeneutics or exegesis. We discussed this in, I think, the first or second lecture. How do you interpret a sacred text? Well, what passages are literal? What about if you have a statement like she has on page 63? So it's easy enough if it says fire cooks rice. Well, everybody knows what that means, right? She gives an example of fire cooks rice. Well, what about fires? Now we have plural, so then you have to engage in, well, what's a plural? What's a singular? How does that affect the verb, right? So fires cook was fire cooks. So even in English, which is much lighter grammatical baggage and system than Sanskrit, but all of these endings of the nouns, endings of verbs, all of that gets analyzed in a meticulous fashion to sort of get to really try to understand what are the Vedas telling us to do, right? And why should we follow? Because if we follow what the Vedas tell us to do, then society will be in its optimal possible state. That represents the well-being of humans, the successful following of Dharma. Dharma is duty, not just Vedic ritualism, remember, that's Dharma, but then the whole social structure that emerges around it. And of course, the Gita is going to be talking about Dharma much more in terms of your duties, not so much about Vedic ritualism. Gita is actually dismissive of Vedic ritualism. It's going to say the fools. They're fools who do these rituals. They're fools. Why are they fools? Because you do your ritual, and by the way, if you do your ritual even in the early period, not only did you have the good things in this life, but in the next life you went to a celestial realm. And Krishna's in the Gita is going to be Kamatmana, Svarga Para, right? Janma Karma Pala Prada. He's going to say, the foolish people, less intelligent, they do these rituals, they go to the celestial realm. Really, what's their motive? Desire. Gita's going to be a big theme that you should act without desire. Mimamsa is all about acting with desire, desire for the good things in this life, desire the celestial realm. Right? Important to make a note of this, because later, certainly the Gita, later moksha traditions, liberation traditions, going to be against desire. Don't do things for desire. Desire is what binds you, because desire produces effects. Then you have to be reborn to get those effects. It's going to be a very, very major. Buddhism, Jainism, they're all going to be pushing against this mimamsa emphasis on desire being the fuel of action. And they're right. Most people do desire. They do act out of desire. But later tradition is going to say, well, but the desire produces a result, and that's rebirth. You have to come back to get that result. So Gita is going to be not reject the Vedas, but say less intelligent people are addicted to these rites. And what's the point? They go up to the celestial realm, but then when they're because they act, and the fruits put them in the fruits of action, the results of action, but they're finite, right? You do X number of actions, and you get X number of fruits that put you in a celestial realm. But what happens when the fruits run out? You have to come back down, right? It's like saying, okay, I got $1 million in the bank account, and I'm going to go to Hawaii, and I'm going to stay in a hotel that costs $1,000 a night. Well, how long can you stay in a hotel for? You do the math, right? 3 years, and then the money runs out. Then what? You go back to New Jersey. So later texts are going to take that view. They're going to be dismissive. But again, notice the importance of mimamsa in determining the discourse. The mimamsa emphasis on action, on desire, is going to provoke a lot of later philosophizing. So that's why we need to be quite clear about what they're doing. Trying to keep the Vedic rituals going. Vedic rituals produce the good things of life in this world and celestial realm in the next. And another thing that I started to say was that, so how do you interpret, how do you know what the Vedas are saying? Fine, let's say, okay, let's accept, right? Dharma is outlined in the Vedas. Nobody rejects that, actually. None of the schools do. Possibly not even Buddhism. Early Buddhism, there's statements that the Buddha seems to say, okay, well, if you're going to be a Brahmin, be a real Brahmin then. So it's not at all clear that the Buddha rejected the Vedas. Maybe later Buddhists did. But Buddha was more about change the emphasis away from ritualism and desire and more onto psychological processes of analysis. But it's not clear that he outrightly had rejected the Vedic rites. But anyway, let's not look at that, because historians, reconstruct. So the other thing that emerges then is, okay, let's accept that the Dharma is that which is expressed in the Vedas. Well, how do we know we're reading the Vedas correctly, right? Because now let's go back to page 63. So you have a statement like, well, rice is cooked. Fine, that's easy enough. But what about a statement like, her hair was pure sunlight? Example, there's lots of these kinds of statements in the Vedas that seem nonsensical from just reading. If you're taking it literally, if you're going to take it literally, what does that mean? Her hair was pure sunlight? So therefore, you have to interpret that. Remember, the Vedas are eternal. They're perfect. You can't just say there's mistakes in them. So you have to have a way of interpreting these kinds of what we would call metaphoric statements. And so Mimamsa established rules. When is something to be taken literally? What if a passage seems to be contradicting itself? What if there's lots of information? What are you supposed to go away with? And so they develop rules. When is metaphor permitted? When is secondary interpretation like a metaphor? You don't take it literally, but you apply secondary interpretation. Okay, her hair was pure sunlight. Well, that really means she had golden hair, right? So that's a secondary interpretation, not literal. So when is that legitimate? All right, you can't just start saying everything is metaphoric, because then what about if the Vedic rites are metaphoric then? You're not really, that's what's going to happen in later traditions, right? Those Vedic rites are going to be seen as internal developments, right? And not actual a fire sacrifice that you throw real things into a real fire to real gods. So you don't want everything to become all of a sudden metaphoric. Then you don't have Vedic rites anymore. So you have to be very careful going down this route of opening the door to metaphoric interpretation, because what if it deconstructs your entire ritual system? So therefore, it might backfire on you. Or Mimamsa then developed these these rules, sophisticated rules that actually are followed by Vedanta. And there's 6 primary rules, like if a passage is lots of different things, maybe even seems like contradictory things in a passage, well, introductory statements carry more weight and conclusory statements. We would say the same thing. If you're writing a paper, right, and you're bringing in all this data and the data's confusing, well, in the introduction, you make a statement. This is what I'm going to do. And I'm going to do da-da-da-da, and you sort of announce your project. And in the conclusion, you do the same thing. You say, well, in this paper, I have done this. This is what I've established. And you re-articulate your main points so that the reader can go away with it. Begin with a clear map of what's going to happen. And at the end, and maybe the actual body of the paper might be busy and data and lots of different things, might get confusing. At the end, okay, this is what I've done. This is what I want you to go away with. So we do that in good writing nowadays. We consider that to be, that's what we do. So Mimamsa developed those kinds of rules. The introductory statements, conclusory statements carry more weight in the event of any kind of conflicts. And like that, things that are repeated carry more weight than something that's just mentioned once. Might be something like, the hair is golden, her hair was pure sunlight mentioned. But what's really the passage all about? Is it about Brahman, for example? Maybe that's a reference to Brahman, right? The golden person in the sun, we're going to see that. Is that really a golden person in the sun, or is that a metaphor for a Brahman? So these rules, then, of textual analysis, sophisticated. So think of all the things that are coming out of this. Astronomy, mathematics, pronunciation, etymology. We nowadays consider that to be historical linguistics, and pronunciation and the 6 Vedangas, and then textual exegesis. Enormous amount of serious and intellectually admirable activity emerges from Vedic rite. Now, we could ask the question, well, let's say we accept all of that, and they're chanting their mantras and doing their rite. Did it really rain? We don't know that. We don't know the answer to that. But clearly, for 2,000 years, I mean, something must have been happening. Otherwise, how could you perpetuate something like that? And not only the entire ancient world actually had this kind of sacrificial, the Greeks, the Romans, the Mesoamericans, the Chinese, in Africa, in pre-Christian Middle East. This was the ancient world involved. The entire, everywhere we look, everything known to anthropology and archaeology seems to have been the earliest form of religion. Was, what right do we have to call it primitive? Just because we don't understand it, just because we don't do it anymore. We don't have any right to say that's primitive. That was the religion of the ancient world. Some form of sacrifice to higher powers. Okay, so the Mimamsa then developed this cult of ritual sacrifices in a far more elaborate and analytical manner than any other tradition known on the planet. Okay, really analyzing every aspect of the ritual culture, the text which supported it, grammar of the text, how to construe meaning, all of this in defense of the Vedas. Okay, so then let's move towards so that's the Purva Mimamsa, the earlier. Mimamsa means inquiry into truth. The word comes from man, to know. So Mimamsa is a desiderative nominal form. That's a complicated grammatical term. So when you desire to know, that's the linguists would call that a desiderative, and the desire to know is actually a noun because it's a desire to know. So the word man, to know or to think, when it's subjected to Sanskrit grammar to become a desiderative nominal, that becomes mimamsa. And there's the Purva Mimamsa, the earlier desire to know, which is this desire to know the ritual and the authority of the ritual and how the ritual functions. And there's the Uttara Mimamsa, which also corresponds, remember, to the Vedic canon, the earlier ritualistic sections, and the later, the Upanishads specifically, which is more about Atman. So the later desire to know is more commonly termed Vedanta. So Vedanta has a different name. It's also known as the Uttara Mimamsa, and Jaimini's the ritualists are known as the Purva Mimamsa earlier, and the Vedanta is Uttara Mimamsa. But more commonly nowadays, we just call it Vedanta. So the Vedanta emerges then, it's the same. It's also accepting the Vedic canon. It's also in that sense accepting that that which is to be known has to be revealed. So they share this common premise with the ritualists. Vedanta shares. Now Vedanta's not going to be, it's going to be less interested in the rituals, not going to reject it. It's going to say, well, it's preparatory. If you do your rituals, you do all that Mimamsa stuff, the earlier Mimamsa stuff, then your mind becomes purified. And as the mind becomes purified, it becomes less interested in just desires, which simply, put you up in a celestial realm, and then you come back down. You have to get, and even if you do your dharma perfectly, you still get old and die. You still suffer. So the notion of suffering emerges. That any form of embodied life is suffering. That all emerges, and the focus then moves away from this sort of just perpetuating embodied life and just and the focus becomes more, well, what is it that goes to the celestial realm? It's not the body. Right? We see that dies and rots and goes back to the earth. What's the innermost self? What is the self that? What is the actual self that can go from one location to another? And so then you get this, then the at least from a Vedanta point of view, then the higher quest. So Uttara doesn't just mean later, right? Purva Mimamsa, the earlier inquiry into truth, rituals, and so forth. Uttara, the later inquiry with the Upanishads, and chronologically later, but the Uttara can also mean higher. The word Uttara can mean later, it can mean higher. So what's the higher truth then? Not just this perform ritual, and then you get to rain, and then you eat, and then the next day you do another ritual, so it rains again, and then and then you do that for your life, and then you die, and you go to a celestial realm, and then what happens when the karma runs out? Back down you come and do it again and again and again, and you get this sense that that life is actually suffer. You're never really satisfied. You always have to struggle to maintain things, right? Even performing a ritual, you have to have the means to do that. So you have to struggle, you have to work, you have to produce food, you have to do all of that, maintain the social order. Huge endeavor, and then at the end, what? You get old and you die, right? So so that kind of a just sort of perpetuating embodied material life starts to become less attractive to the in the Upanishads. So the Vedanta emerges, and they're interested in, well, what is the Atman? What is the deep level self? The one that undergoes reincarnation. Who is that self? Let's seek that self. Let's not just get sidetracked by all these rituals. We don't reject it, but that's a lower kind of quest. Higher quest. What's the self? And therefore, you get the sense of people renouncing society and going to the forest. Right? And we're not going to be part of this ritual culture and the whole social system that's preserving it. We don't, these Brahmins, these ritualists, they can't give us deep level truth. They can just tell us how to keep the world going. But what about deep level truth? So then the sense of, let's get away from all that. How do you get away? Well, let's go to the forest. There's no distraction there. So you get sort of the sense that some of this is going on in the forest, the Aranya. Again, this is a Vedanta reading of the Upanishads. If you're a Marxist, and there's a whole book about the Upanishads, is really arguing. It's not, the Atman discussion is a marginal thing. It's really about conflict and power between kingdoms, but we're looking at the Upanishads through the lens of the Vedanta tradition. For them, the Upanishads are books that are not prescriptive. Okay, prescriptive versus descriptive. Mimamsa, the earlier Mimamsa, the Vedas are prescribing. The injunctions are telling us what to do. Right? Why we do the sacrifice? Why? Because they're prescribed in the text, and that's why we do it, and then we preserve them, and that's how the cosmos will function in a healthy manner. For the Vedantins, no, some prescription might be there, but what's that prescription? Seek the self. That's the real prescription. But mostly they would think of the Upanishads as descriptive. They're describing, they're saying there is a self, there is a deep level self, there's something that is going up to the celestial realm and coming back down, and it doesn't have to keep doing that. It can be liberated from that. It can be freed. Okay, you get all of these early notions coming from the Upanishads. Of course, they get developed in a much more sophisticated way in the later traditions, but that's the later traditions are piggybacking, springboarding off the Upanishadic earlier claims. So then you have now by the way, and so then one of the main themes from a Vedanta point of view in the Upanishads is that the deep level self is called Atman. You need to know that word, Atman. There's also talk about a sort of cosmic self, Brahman, right? The very second verse of the Vedanta Sutra. What is Brahman? It is that from which the Janmadya Syayata, that from which this universe emerges. So you get the sense that there's Brahman, which is the sort of cosmic origins. Might call it God, but be careful about projecting notions from other traditions. But let's not call it God. Let's stick with the term Brahman. But in the sense that God is the absolute truth in the Abrahamic tradition. So in that sense, Brahman is the ultimate truth that supports everything, and it's intelligent. Okay, it's not just matter. It's not inanimate, atoms and forces, or subatomic particles and forces. There's an animate. There's intelligence. Okay, so the Vedanta is what we nowadays would call in science intelligent design. There's intelligence behind the universe, right? But let's get to that in due course of time with the logicians. We're going to say, well, there must be something that triggered Big Bang. Of course, they didn't talk about Big Bang, but there must be something that brings the atoms together and causes creation. There must be a creator. But let's wait for that. For now, let's just say Vedanta is about that not only is the Brahman the cause of everything, but it's intelligent. It thinks. So, based on the Vedanta is all about cryptic statements in the Upanishads and interpreting them in the support of this Brahman. Now, so we have Brahman and Atman. Are they the same thing? Is Atman just a mini kind of like, there's an Atman in me? The text suggests that there's one and the same thing, but are they exactly one and the same thing? Is the Atman a spark, an individual, and does it then, when it becomes liberated from rebirth, does it just merge back into Brahman, like a drop of water merges back in the ocean? It's no longer a drop of water. It's there, but it's now one with the ocean. Or is it eternally distinct? She doesn't actually, Hamilton is a good little book here, but she only seems to be, at least in these beginning chapters, she's only talking about one school of Vedanta, which is the Atman merging into Brahman, right? The oneness. She seems to be, but there are other schools, powerful schools of Vedanta that accept that there is some kind of unity between Atman and Brahman, but not a merging. Could be unity, and Brahman becomes like a personal God, and the Atman is has an eternal relationship as an individual. So, so it's not necessarily monistic, right? Monistic is when remember we had the discussion monistic versus monotheistic. Monism is like drop of water, becomes one in an absolute way with the ocean. Rainwater hits the ocean. It's not rainwater anymore. It's just now part of the ocean. That's monism. And monotheism is, okay, there's a oneness, there's one God, but the Atmans are sparks, so they have the same infinitesimally small nature of God, perhaps, like a spark of a fire, but distinct. So keep that in mind. So some Vedanta traditions are dualistic. There's a dualism between the Atman and Brahman, and others are, no, ultimately they may seem distinct, like now I'm in this body, but when I become liberated, I simply become one with Brahman. So there are non-dual schools, non-dual, monism, Atman merges, no duality, no two anymore, just one. You can call it monism or you can call it non-dualism, same thing. If it's non-dual, then if it's not two, then it's one. So monism, one, and non-dualism are the same thing. Okay, let's get our terminology clear. We call it, in Western philosophy, we call it monism. But in the Indian philosophy, they don't call it monism, they call it advaita, not dwa, not two, non-dualism. But it's the same thing for our purposes. And there are dualist schools, which debate the non-dualists and say, no, there's a distinction between us and God, right? We're in ignorance. God is never in ignorance. How can we be the same? We're trapped in a body. God is not trapped by anything. He's supremely independent and so forth, okay? So then, just so you have, from the Vedic tradition, then you have the Mimamsa Sutra. Mimamsa, one of the schools that emerged, the so-called six schools. The other is Vedanta. These six schools write their canonical texts that become the anchoring point of the school. They become the canon of the school, just like the Bible is the canonical text for Christianity, and the Quran is for Islam. So the Vedas are the ultimate canonical text, but then the Vedas need clarification, they need analysis, they need systematization. There's so much there. So from this Vedic text, this is what makes them Hindu schools. The 6 schools are what we call Hindu. They didn't call themselves Hindu; they would be Vedic schools. What makes them Vedic schools as opposed to Buddhism, which doesn't, eventually rejects the Vedic text and creates its own Buddhist canon, the teachings of the Buddha. We'll discuss that soon. So the Vedic traditions, then, they accept the Vedic text, but then each school has its own canonical text, which claims to be an interpretation or a clarification of the Vedas. Some of them claim to be. But if they don't claim to be a clarification, at least they accept the Vedas in some way. Sankhya doesn't claim to be that. Neither does yoga, neither does Nyaya. But 3 of them specifically claim to be sort of clarifications of the Veda. Maybe Vaisheshika, we'll discuss that when we get to it. But certainly Mimamsa and Vedanta, 2 of the schools, claim to be clarification of the Vedic corpus. We'll deal with the other schools and their relationship with the Vedas. They are less concerned with interpreting the Vedas, but they accept them. They all accept them. That's what makes them orthodox. Okay, they all accept them, but 2 of them are all about nothing other than interpreting the Vedic text, and the other 4 accept the Vedas, but kind of then do their own thing, and then they say, well, this is Vedic, okay, but they're not so much quoting the Vedic canon as Mimamsa are and Vedanta. Okay, so Mimamsa are interested in the rituals, preservation of the ritual. Vedanta are interested in the relationship between Atman and Brahman, between understanding Brahman and understanding Atman, and are they the same? What's the relationship between Atman and Brahman? Is there one and the same, and so forth? Now, each of those 6 schools writes its own canonical texts, right? Vedas are canonical for everybody, whether actual or just sort of in a formal sort of sense. They all have their own, except for Sankhya, which is lost, the original. And their canonical text is called a sutra. The original Sankhya Sutra then is lost, but a later text called the Sankhya Karika provides that. And our course, we're going to be reading something from each of those 6 canonical texts. Okay, but for now, we need to read the sutra. Okay, sutra is a style of writing. Each of these schools have their own sutra. Vedanta Sutra, Mimamsa Sutra, the Nyaya Sutra, the logicians, Vaisheshika Sutra, metaphysicians, the Yoga Sutras, and the Sankhya had a sutra, but it got lost, and so now we have a later text, and it's not called a Sankhya Sutra, it's called a Sankhya Karika. Don't worry about that. We will get to that. So a later text, it takes that place holder, becomes, provides that function of a canonical text for Sankhya. So what is a sutra? It's a minimalistic, little aphorism. It has to be you can't really understand a sutra. They're minimalistic. The Yoga Sutra that I translated, there's 198 sutras, and the average number of words in a sutra is only 6. So you don't understand. And Vedanta Sutra is even worse in the sense that it's even more minimalistic. So you can't understand a sutra because they had to be memorized and they needed to be unpacked by the teacher. They're almost symbolic when they're not. I mean, they're very, very cryptic. And so therefore you have your canonical text of each of the schools, bearing in mind what I said about Sankhya, in a sutra form. And then you have commentaries written later, after Badarayana writes the Vedanta Sutra, and each of the sutras has its, Jaimini writes the Mimamsa Sutra, that we've discussed those so far. But then the sutras need to be interpreted because they're so cryptic. So later intellectuals, then they unpack the sutras. And that's the tradition. That's what makes a tradition. A tradition is the sutra canonical text. And we can't really make sense of a lot of the sutras. And so later tradition comes along and explains it. So whereas sutra, like in the Yoga Sutras, the sutra has an average of 6 words. Well, Vyasa, the oldest commentator, he'll write 20 lines or so, or whatever he writes. Perhaps 20 lines or more or less. But, he'll write extensively on what the 6 words mean. And so we cannot read the sutras without the commentaries. So Indian knowledge systems are embodied in a sutra text. Sutra texts are connected to the Vedas. Vedanta and Mimamsa are completely connected to the Vedas. The other four, they accept the Vedas, but really they just go on and do their own thing, practically speaking. But they accept. They don't reject the Vedas. They claim to be following the Vedas. And so each of these schools then has its canonical text, the text that written by a founder, that it captures the main contours of that tradition, the claims of that tradition, and then we have numerous not just one commentary. We'll have generations of commentaries in some cases that expand on the sutra, tells us what they mean, and those commentaries are in later generations, and they're also engaging with their intellectual moment, right? So they might be engaging Buddhists that maybe the early sutras didn't necessarily. But the later commentaries, or they engage Buddhism much more robustly as Buddhism becomes more of a threat or a challenge to the claims of each tradition. And so they're engaging with their modern moment, just like, for example, yoga psychology now in our day and age, right? Yoga is very popular. Well, it's going to have to engage with, modern psychology and the claims of our modern knowledge systems like psychology and neurology and brain science and so forth. And so we have these conversations going on. These traditions are still alive. And likewise, Vedanta is going to have to deal with physics and the claim of Big Bang and, all of this. So therefore, our modern day, if these traditions are to survive and not just be archaic, just like Plato and Aristotle, they're still philosophers of religion that maybe don't accept everything in Plato and Aristotle, but they accept aspects of it and they argue for them and they perpetuate these intellectual strains. And there's Christians that are. That's what theologians do. They're trying to their duty is to make Christian claims. They have to, what's Big Bang going to do to Genesis and the claims of Genesis? There has to be a conversation. How do we, how do these traditions, to make if a tradition is to be alive, it has to communicate with this modern intellectual moment. Okay, so this has been going on for centuries in ancient India, as in all other cultures, and that's what the commentaries do. They interpret the sutras, right, of the canonical text, and they also are having conversations and debates with their intellectual moment. Okay, so all of that is a sutra, and there's a couple of terms we need to know. Finally, I think I've covered everything, and these schools are called Darshanas. Remember, which is like actually perceiving truth. It's not just an intellectual activity. They see themselves that if you follow their philosophical points of view and their practices, these traditions also have practices, right? Vedic ritual, the practice of the ritual. Vedanta is you cultivate knowledge, study the sacred text. It rearranges your mind. So then, if your mind is rearranged, you perceive reality different, right? This is another aspect that it becomes important. After all, we see the world through the lens of the mind. So that's fairly obvious, right? I mean, you think of a child sees the world in a certain way, and then as the child gets educated, it changes the way it sees the world. Maybe a child thinks there's monsters under its bed, and imagines monsters under its bed and is afraid. But then as it grows older, it realizes, well, there's no monsters, and so therefore that affects the way it sees its environment. So therefore, these traditions are not purely intellectual. Their goal isn't to just engage in intellectuality for the sake of intellectuality, but the goal is to adjust the way we see the world and try to see its truth. And so therefore, the term for the schools are darshana. They are ways of seeing the world, and certainly all of the six schools eventually, even Mimamsa, later on, not in the early Mimamsa, which is just about ritual, not about liberation, but all of the schools, including eventually with Bhaskara, including later on in Mimamsa, become connected with the notion of seeing reality in such a way that eventually we can become liberated from its bonds, the bonds of action and reaction and embodiment itself, right? Now we're bound, right? We're bound in the body. We can't deny that. Whether we accept karma or not, we certainly know we're bound. We don't know what our fate is. We don't know what's going to happen in 5 minutes. Who can deny that? So, therefore, the notion that we are sort of trapped in some sort of way or subject to laws, let's put it that way, I think no one can disagree. Whether you want to call them the laws of physics or the laws of our neurons in our brain, you might find some other paradigm to make sense of it. But who can deny that we are subject to laws? And so to the Indian, eventually everyone, the notion of karma and reincarnation becomes absolutely dominant. There are still materialists, there are still people that resist that, but they become, but certainly the intellectual traditions and Hinduism writ large, it becomes completely committed to the idea of karma and reincarnation and rebirth, and that the goal of life, the ultimate goal of life, there may be immediate goals of life. In fact, the four goals of life are articulated, emerge. That there is, karma, dharma, artha, moksha. There is desire, the pursuit of desire, and then there is dharma. That if you do your duties, then good things will come to you. So then there's dharma, artha, kama. Let's rearrange that. It's arranged differently in different texts. But let's start with dharma. If you do your duty, then artha, then there's well-being, and then so it's the second goal of life. The first is dharma. Going back to the Vedic Mimamsas are strong on this, and actually nobody rejects that. No one rejects that. But some will just say that there are three lesser goals and one real goal. But let's outline the four goals. So dharma, do your duty, right? Vedic ritual, be a good civic citizen, whatever your caste is, do those duties. And as a result of that, dharma, artha, you'll get the good things of life. Make good karma, so good things will happen to you. Unless you did some awful karma in a past life that's still due to you, but for the most part, if you are dharmic, then artha, well-being will ensue, and then if well-being ensues, then karma. Not karma with an R, but K-A-M-A, karma, karma. Okay, karma is work, but kama is lust, desire. When you get the good things of life, then you can enjoy them. You can try to enjoy them. So then you can try to, in a dharmic way, always in a dharmic way, but you can enjoy those good things. Enjoy this world, celestial realm in the next, right? So that becomes, those three things are primary to Mimamsa. Okay, remember Mimamsa, the early Mimamsa. But then Vedanta comes along and goes, well, okay, so you do your dharma, fine, and if you do your dharma, yeah, we agree, you get artha, you get well-being, no one denies that, and kama, K-A-M-A, then you can enjoy, but the Mimamsa will say that enjoyment will never satisfy you. And then what's the point? And then you die and you get some, as we said before, go to the celestial realm, come back down. So Vedanta adds moksha. Right? The real goal is moksha, to be liberated from all this. That's the ultimate goal. The other three goals they don't reject them. They say most people have to go through them. And if they're smart, at least at the end of life, they'll seek moksha. And that becomes a sort of fourth goal of life, certainly for the higher castes. But then we get also this alternative. We see it in Patanjali and elsewhere. But what? We don't actually have to go through it. You could just go for moksha right from the start. We see that in Advaita Vedanta and some of the more world-renouncing traditions. Certainly Buddhism, right? You don't have to go through all of that. Just renounce. Why go through all of that to end up at moksha? Why go through? Anything could happen on the way. Maybe you get sidetracked. Maybe you get old in the end, and you don't have the energy to seek moksha. You don't want to stop controlling the mind and controlling desires. So you're taking a risk. Why not just, if you're young and you have this wisdom that the real goal is ultimately liberation, well, why not just go for liberation right from the start? And so today, even in India, you see sadhus wandering around, monks, sadhus. And some of them are young, and they have this from a young age. Maybe from nowadays, people would say they did their practices in a past life. And they came to this realization that what's the point in doing dharma, artha, and kama if I'm only going to end up seeking moksha at the end? Let me seek moksha right from the beginning then. Why should I get married and engage in social duties? I'll wander around as a renunciate. So that's a very strong element. And we also discussed it. Remember the Brahmana Shramana tension we discussed, not tension, but the sort of dichotomy that we discussed in an earlier class. Okay, so one other thing that so that these are the four goals of life. Okay, and moksha then becomes central to Vedanta, and it becomes central to all of the traditions, including Mimamsa later on. Although Mimamsas are always going to anchor everything in the first three, whereas Vedanta is going to be much less interested. Shankar's going to say you don't have to do them at all. Ramanuja, some Vedantins will say you should go through those three to realize, because otherwise, you have to realize that desire is unfulfilling. If you don't go through them, you won't have a strong relationship to moksha. If you try to attain liberation when you're too young, you'll have all these desires in your mind still that interfere. You won't really know, you might fall from the path. Whereas if you go through, the dharma, artha, karma, you do your duty and try to enjoy, then you'll get frustrated. But that frustration will be deep, and that will help you. Once you get frustrated, then that now, because of frustration, you seek something else. You seek liberation. So it'll be a stronger relationship with liberation if you've gone through the frustration of life. But if you try to do it too early, Ramanuja might say, one of the Vedantins, some of the Vedantins, if you do it too early, it might be a nice ideal, let me seek liberation. But if you haven't failed, if in fulfilling your desires, you haven't pursued your desires, those desires might haunt you later. They might tempt you later and say, come, leave this spiritual path, follow desire. So better you go through it and get frustrated and then seek moksha. So there'll be different opinions by Vedantins, right? Some will say just go for moksha in the beginning. Others will say, no, you got to go through that whole worldly business first and then seek liberation. So there'll be differences. One other term, and now changing track a little bit, and the term Purva Paksha. Please write that down. She has it written in the last page, 69. Right in the last paragraph, 5 lines down. The Purva Paksha, opposing point of view. All of these sutra traditions, right? They wrote their Vedanta Sutra, Mimamsa Sutra, Nyaya Sutra. They're not just promoting their point of view, they're also engaging other points of view. They may agree with many of the other schools, but wherever another school contradicts their point of view, they engage that and debate that. Okay? So, for the most part, they focus on different things. Mimamsa is focusing on action and ritual. Vedanta is focusing on moksha. Vaisheshika, from the 6 schools, and these are the names of the 6 schools. Vaisheshika is focusing on metaphysics. Sankhya is focusing on metaphysics. So they share some things, but they also have differences. And where they have differences, they engage the different point of view. That opponent's point of view is the Purva Paksha. Purva, the other Paksha, the other view. So, for example, the Vedanta Sutra has 4 chapters. The second chapter is all about the Purva Paksha, the opposing point of view. So that in that second chapter you have the Vedanta response to Buddhism, to Jainism, to Sankhya, to a number of schools. So that's important to know, okay? And therefore, the term that we need to know for this course, because we're going to be reading something from each of these 6 sutra traditions. And in Sankhya, remember, it's the Sankhya Karika that takes that place of there, because the original Sankhya Sutra is lost. So each of those traditions will be responding. We're saying, look, if you say that, how do you know the Purva Paksha? The Purva Paksha is usually introduced with something like, if you say this, well, we respond this. So that's how you identify a Purva Paksha. It's not necessarily named. Not necessarily named. It's just that if somebody suggests this other point of view that's different from ours, well, this is how we respond to it. So this keeps Indian intellectuality non-dogmatic, keeps it alive and engaged with its intellectual environment. Okay, so please remember the term Purva Paksha, and I hope I've. And the other thing that she discusses in 68 is, how do we know things? How do we know? Okay, this is called pramana. Okay, pramana is the means of knowledge. So remember, Vedanta and Mimamsa, in their different ways, are going to say we know things because the sacred texts tell us. We've discussed this a few times. You know things from sense perception. Some schools are going to, like Nyaya, they're going to prioritize that. Everybody sort of accepts sense perception as the most powerful. But, and then from sense perception, you make inferences. Inferences are based on sense perception. So everybody accepts the three ways of knowing, but different schools lay emphasis on different ways of knowing. Okay, three ways of knowing. Sense perception. From that you make inferences. Remember inference, right? I see smoke. I make an inference as okay, how do I know the fire? I can see it, number one, sense perception. But what if I don't see it, but I see smoke in the sky? I infer, oh, there must be a fire that caused that. I haven't seen the fire, though, so that's an inference. Well, the third way is someone can tell you. Someone can say, well, there's fire on the mountain over there. You can't go there today. Words. Okay? Now, these words can be lower or higher, right? They can be just words about mundane reality. There's fire on the mountain. But what about things that we can never perceive? Like, what's the cause of the universe? You can make some inferences. You might be able to say, well, the cause of the universe is intelligent. There must be intelligence, but you don't know what kind of intelligence. Maybe there's several intelligences. Maybe even Descartes said, what if it's a demon that's created the world? So therefore, for things that you can't see or make inferences about, then there are higher words. There's lower words about mundane reality, but higher words. And that's revelation. That's sacred text. Okay? So connecting that with what we've discussed, Mimamsa and Vedanta are interested in the sacred texts. Different, right? Mimamsa wants the older texts about ritual, right? That we have to do these ritual. The words tell us to do the ritual. The words are eternal. All of that, what we discussed, they're not created by some human, which allows them to be perfect. So they're apurusha, no purusha, no person has articulated them. I got the sun behind me. Sorry about this. I've come a little bit closer to the screen. So the Vedanta they are focused on the three ways from the three ways of knowing. They prioritize words, but words of the sacred text. Okay, and for Vedanta, it's not so much the ritual, the earlier Vedic canon, the Vedic hymns that you recite during the ritual, and the Brahmanas, the second strata of sacred text that tell you how to perform the ritual. They're interested in the last of the four strata that we discussed of the sacred Vedic canon to the Upanishads. And they tell you, what do they tell you? What do those words tell you? They tell you about Atman and Brahman and the real goal of life. Otherwise you can't perceive. You can't perceive reincarnation. You might be able to make an inference, a cause and effect inference. You could, and say that there must be reincarnation because every action has a reaction. That's a universal principle. But they prioritize the word. Okay. And then the other schools, Nyaya, the logicians, they prioritize inference. They accept sense perception and they accept the words, but really the Nyaya is about what can we know by inference, not just from sacred texts. And likewise, these other schools, Sankhya, it's about inference, and Vaisheshika also about inference. Okay, so these six schools, they mostly accept three sources of knowledge, right? Sense perception, inference, and words. Some only accept two, and for reasons that we'll discuss, the materialists only accept one, sense perception, that's it. And some accept six, Vedanta. So there's different ways of knowing, but the way of knowing is a pramana. Okay, that's on page 68. Pramana is how do we know? And we've discussed three ways we know. But some say two, some say one, some say six. But any way of knowing is a pramana. To know something, I know it because I see it. I know it because I infer it must be the case. That's the only explanation for smoke is fire. Make an inference. And finally, I know something because words have told me. Either that I've written, nowadays we read, but then it would be oral. Someone told me. That person has to be authoritative, and there has to be a discussion about what makes words authoritative. Of course, they have those extended discussions. But in principle, most of us, we know things from the words on the TV, right? We know what's going on in the news. Well, words. We watch the TV, we watch our news programs, and that tells us what's going on in different parts of the world. Those are words. We haven't perceived it ourselves, and we see the images, and when we make inferences, those images correspond to real things, but we haven't personally seen them. So actually, most of the knowledge, most of the things we think we know, come from words, right? Books we've read, that's words, and so forth. Okay, all right. So then we need to know these two terms, right? Put them on the list: pramana, a means of knowing, And in some schools, it's also the ensuing state of knowledge. The actual knowledge itself is pramana. And we'll get to that when we get to Nyaya. But for now, pramana is a means of knowledge, and purva paksha, opposing point of view. And that's it for chapter 4 of Hamilton.